Testing 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. Well, apparently it's working. All righty. Welcome. Welcome to dis&dat 28 October. We're at welcome to dis&dat Dussel on Marx's Economic Manuscripts of 1861 to 63, Chapter 3. We finished off Chapter 2 yesterday, and this is one of the figures from Chapter 2. I think it's important to think about the difference between the exteriority and the interiority, or the new totality, right? The difference between totality and exteriority, that is, not capital versus not living labor. And while it may seem to some a simple distinction, for many others, it's harder to figure, and in some ways, difficult to imagine that particular concept. But we'll try. So we're looking at Enrique Dussel's Towards an Unknown Mark, commentary on the manuscripts of 1861 to 63. We're up to Chapter 3, which is on relative surplus value. So 3.1 is on the character of the figure 3.1 is on the character of labor and its degrees of subsumption. And note, of course, that we see the difference between formal subsumption in the second box and real subsumption in the fourth box here. And it comes from this idea that things on the one hand seem isolated, as in each isolated laborer reproduces the value of his labor capacity. We see that within the context of the workshop, or under manufacture, we go from formal subsumption to real subsumption when we see class divisions or social divisions of social labor within the labor context. But we can see ultimately that this bears on the difference between capitalists and laborers. And so these are the isolated lives of workers. This is manufacturing, or the factory. These are the specifically different labors, the division of labor, the pin factory, for example. And these are the different machines, M1 to MN, and AL is the abstract labors actually subsumed. This is that moment where, we can at least start talking about what counts as being exploited, right? Or expropriated. And so relative surplus value. Here, the value of labor capacity falls, and therefore the necessary labor time too, not because the price of labor capacity has fallen below its value, but because its value itself has fallen, i.e., because less labor time is subjectified in the labor capacity, and therefore less labor time is required for its reproduction. In this case, surplus labor time grows because necessary labor time has diminished. A part of the overall working day, which was previously reserved for necessary labor, is now set free, is annexed to the surplus labor time. A part of the necessary labor time is converted into surplus labor time. Hence, a position of the product which previously entered the wage now enters the surplus value, that is, the capitalist gain. That's Marx. And what we're looking at is relative surplus value, notebooks 3, 4, and 5, pages 125 to 211, up to March 1862 in the MECW 30. To a certain extent, to a greater extent, than in the expositions regarding absolute surplus value. In this case, Marx performs for the first time a systematic writing with many novelties. In plans of February or March 1859, he had included a great part, a third part, regarding relative surplus value. He had divided the subject into a general introduction with references to the Grundrisse, and then into 3 sections. Number 1, cooperation. Number 2, division of labor. Number 3, machinery. This is the section he used to approach the subject in notebooks 3 to 5. 3.1, the essence of relative surplus value. Marx discusses the essence of relative surplus value. That is to say, in the first place, it is necessary to describe the essence of relative surplus value in general, and then to subsequently approach from the abstract to the concrete the particular ways in which relative surplus value becomes concrete. Marx starts by pointing out the specific difference. We call the form of surplus quote, we call the form of surplus value considered so far absolute surplus value because in every increase is at the same time, every increase is at the same time an absolute increase of created value, that is, of produced value. The extension of the normal working day, the total of necessary labor time plus the surplus labor time, is here the process by which surplus value grows is increased. So yes, it's a necessary or an additional or whatever level of abstraction. Back to the back to the text. Once the working day has reached a physically unsurpassable maximum, fulfilling, however, the tendency of capital to posit more surplus value, relative surplus value is left only with the shortening of the necessary labor time. And we've gone over this in other contexts. It must be understood that the purpose of this essential tendency of capital is not to increase the productivity of the productive force, nor even to decrease necessary labor time per se, but to increase surplus value. The other two are necessary conditions for surplus value to increase. Now, it could be argued by paying lower wages, the same end could be reached, but methodologically and essentially, Marx recalls that the assumption of all the discourse in abstract in general is that commodities are sold at their value. Thus, the phenomenon, that is the super manifestation, not the essential, regarding the fact that wages can be priced under or over their value, has been left aside for a later specific treatise on wages, right? So if the working day cannot grow and if wages cannot decrease, there is only one way for surplus value to increase, quote, through an increase of the productivity of labor or through a higher development of the productive potency of labor. Either, making labor, right, work harder. This is that difference described in book 1 in a more simple way between absolute surplus value and relative surplus value. That is, either you increase the working day in the absolute sense, or the day remains the same. And what you have to do in order to produce relative surplus value is to increase the efficiency or the speed at which labor operates, which, with all with respect, is that well, we see what happens anyway. Back to the text. Now then, the text quoted at the beginning of this chapter should be read carefully. At the essential abstract level, or considering society and classes as global totality, Marx points out that an increase in labor's productivity increases the mass of products, but this higher mass has the same value. In other words, the individual commodity therefore falls in value. This is of great importance for the question of dependency in Latin America, because capital of peripheral underdeveloped countries has a lower productivity. Their products have a greater value, or a greater proportion of necessary labor time per unit of product, although a lower global production of surplus value. In other words, the difference between the global north and the global south, and who gets what kind of capital is getting exported to the global north. The global north gets more, in other words. Once again, Marx, back to the text, once again, Marx now explains the differences in order to clarify the categories. Quote, relative surplus value is therefore distinguished from absolute as follows. In both, surplus value equals surplus labor, or the ratio of surplus value is equal to the ratio of surplus labor time to necessary labor time. In the first case, that is absolute surplus value, the working day is extended, as we just described. The working day is extended beyond its limits. It's not the 10-hour day or whatever, the 8-hour day, etc. And the surplus value grows, or the surplus labor time grows, in proportion as the working day is extended beyond its limit. In the second case, that is relative surplus value, the working day is given. Here, the surplus value, or the surplus labor time, is increased owing to the reduction of the portion of the working day that was required or was necessary for the reproduction of the wage. The wage is the same in that sense, right? In the first case, a given level of the productivity of labor is presupposed. In the second case, the productivity of labor is raised. In the first case, the value of an aliquot part of the total product, or a part of the product of the working day, remains unchanged. In the second, the value of the part of the product changes, but its quantity, that is the number of articles, grows in the same proportion as its value diminishes, right? In other words, you speed up work. The value of the total amount thus remains unchanged, whilst the total amount of products or use values has increased. Close quote. This long quotation should be supplemented with another of equal density in order to understand Marx's form of constructing categories, which he practiced methodically to know by differentiation. Quote, surplus value exactly equals surplus labor. An increase in surplus labor is exactly measured by a reduction in necessary labor. With absolute surplus value, the reduction in necessary labor is relative, i.e., necessary labor falls relatively because overtime is increased directly, right? That you extend the day. Here, therefore, necessary labor time is reduced relatively because total labor time, and therefore surplus labor time, has grown absolutely. In contrast to this, if the normal working day is given and the increase in relative surplus value occurs through an increase in productive forces, the necessary labor time is lessened absolutely in the absolute sense, and the surplus value is thereby increased both absolutely and relatively without any increase in the value of product. In the case of absolute surplus value, therefore, there is a relative fall in the value of wages as compared with the absolute growth in surplus value, whereas in the case of relative surplus value, there is an absolute fall in the value of wages. Close quote. Now, let us see what this all is. Back to the text. Let us see what this is all about. Marx always has in mind two moments, that is, necessary time and surplus labor, level 1 of figure 2.1 of a whole, that is, the whole working day. If surplus labor increases absolutely, then the working day also increases in the same manner. And this is the case of absolute surplus value. If the working day does not increase but remains constant, and necessary time decreases due to greater productivity, the surplus value increases, and this is the case of relative surplus value. Thus, in the case of absolute surplus value, the reduction of the necessary time is relative or proportional to the increase of surplus time, and the increase of surplus value is absolute per se. While in the case of relative surplus value, the reduction of the necessary time is absolute, and the increase of surplus value is relative to the reduction of necessary time and absolute per se. Marx then multiplies multiple types of logical and real possibilities, many of which turn out to be superfluous, but some remain essential. One such case is the paradox, which shows that an increase in productivity amounts to a decrease in the value of product, which is the foundation of crises and the essential fall of capitalism as a process of devalorization. Footnote 4. Just as in the case of absolute surplus value, there's a limit to the duration of the working day. In the case of relative surplus value, there's also a limit fixed by the various proportions between the increases in productivity, surplus value, and the total capital invested. Quote, the ratio of the surplus value to the total value of the capital expended does not increase in the same proportion as the necessary labor fall through the increase in productive power. There are two reasons why this does not happen. Firstly, because with the more developed productive power of labor, surplus value does not grow in the same proportion as necessary labor diminishes. Secondly, because this is surplus value, which has grown in a smaller proportion, is calculated on capital, which has increased its value approximately in proportion to the heightening of productive power, close quote. Now, this is precisely the issue of decline in the rate of profit, or the relation between surplus value and the total advanced capital, right? This is the kind of overall presupposition, or the conclusion that is followed by a lot of folks about the question of rate of profit falling ultimately because of the organic composition of capital, etc. If the capital invested in wages, variable capital, is compared with surplus labor, the result is the rate of exploitation or surplus value, right? So what we're trying to go from is surplus value itself to the rate of surplus value, the rate of exploitation, which does not include constant capital. In other words, the machines don't change. It's just variable capital that's changing, and therefore the relation to wages is diminished in the sense that you get this is the pay stub again. Because the increase of productivity demands more constant capital, the relation of surplus value to the total capital invested in wages and means of production, the latter, that is, means of production, in an ever greater proportion due to the development of productive power, must be taken into consideration. Hence, it becomes more difficult to increase not absolute surplus value, but the relation between surplus value and total capital invested. This ratio decreases in the same proportion as the development of constant capital increases. So, in other words, the machines don't change. In fact, they may get better or bigger or whatever. But the thing that is getting exploited is, the interaction, the labor being used in order to make stuff. On the other hand, since the value of commodities decreases due to an increase of productivity, the value of labor capacity, namely the wages, also decreases, relative to the total wage bill, I suppose. And relative surplus value increases in proportion to the easier reproduction of waged labor. More fertile soil is not the only cause of a fall in the price of subsistence or consumption goods, as Ricardo assumed, but also a greater productive of power labor subsumed by capital, and for capital for its valorization by means of relative surplus value. I know that gets a little more abstract, but the point is Marx is trying to get to this point where you can describe what is being alienated. You know, the machines don't change. The only variable in this particular type of equation is how much work, and either being sped up or a variety of productivity measures are at work. All right, 3.2. The general form of subsumption as cooperation, right? There are three forms or phenomena of relative surplus value, or real and concrete modes of increasing the productive power of labor subsumed by capital. The general form, the allgemeine form, or the fundamental form, the Grundform of all increase of productivity of social labor is cooperation, which is present also in the two remaining forms. As the fundamental form, it is the basis, the presupposition of the remaining forms. It also has 6 essential determinations. Cooperation is therefore first of all the direct collective labor that is unmediated by exchange of many workers in order to produce the same result, the same product, and the same use value or utility, close quote. Any subsequent form of increasing productivity presupposes and includes cooperation, since it provides the social form for the act of labor itself. From hunting to war, humanity had already used various types of labor and cooperation. In capitalism, however, the sociability of labor reaches its most developed stage. Each worker, isolated in his everyday life, becomes social in its negative conception, namely, the productive power of the individual is increased by the social form of labor, Gesellschaftlich. But such sociability is constituted from capital and remains under its control. Quote, cooperation, which is a productive power of social labor, appears as a productive power of capital, not of labor. Once the worker enters into the actual labor process, he has already incorporated qua labor capacity into capital. He no longer belongs, you've punched in. He no longer belongs to himself, but to capital, and therefore the conditions under which he works are rather the conditions under which capital works. However, now this is the command element, I suppose. However, before he steps into the labor process, he enters into contact with the capitalist as the individual owner or seller of a commodity. That is, this commodity is the person's own labor capacity. He sells it as an isolated commodity. Footnote 5. It becomes social once it has entered into the labor process. The metamorphosis, its labor capacity, undergoes thereby is something external to it, in which he does not participate. It is rather something which is done to it. The capitalist buys not one, but many individual labor capacities at the same time, but he buys them all as isolated commodities belonging to isolated, mutually independent commodity owners. Now, once they enter into the labor process, they are already incorporated into capital, and their own cooperation is therefore not a relation into which they put themselves. It is the capitalist who puts them into it. That is, their interconnection and their utility lies not in themselves, but in capital. or the social productive power of their labor arising therefrom is a productive power of capital, just as the power of individual labor capacity, not only to replace but to increase itself, that is surplus labor, appears as a capacity of capital, so does the social character of labor and the productive power which arises from that character. Now, this is the first stage at which the subsumption of labor under capital no longer appears as a merely formal subsumption, but changes the mode of production itself, so that the capitalist mode of production is the specific mode of production, close quote. Hence, it can be noted for Marx at the moment when capital organizes labor in cooperation under its control, subsumption is no longer merely formal, but more profound, and the mode of the productive process, materially speaking, but related to the production of surplus value, changes technically, and is incorporated into the formal process of production of economic value. Only now, and into the formal process of production of economic value. Only now, and not as in the case of an increase in the hours of labor by the mode of absolute surplus value, the mode of production is properly and specifically capitalist. That is to say, the subsumption is formal insofar as the individual worker, instead of working as an independent commodity worker, see the gig economy, right? Belonging to the capitalist, this distinction is formal insofar as it can exist without causing the slightest alteration of any kind in the mode of production or the social relations within which production takes place, close quote. Marx is here thinking of a material technical change in the labor process itself. Before cooperation, in a certain way, the laborer does not change the mode or the manner of the technical labor process. Now, on the contrary, cooperation materially changes the intimate or the intrinsic. Cooperation changes the intrinsic labor process, organizing it, controlling it, this is command stuff, right? Modifying it in the same process. Only now, capital subsumes the laborer more than formally. It modifies his productive habits. It takes his consciousness away from him. It takes the control over the material process away from him. So it is about, converting this question of consciousness relative to labor power in its relation to control. Anyway, back to Marx, quote, the first transposition of the social character of labor as social character of capital, of the productive power of social labor as productive power of capital. And finally, the first transformation of the formal subsumption under capital into a real alteration of the mode of production itself. Close quote. Now, once again, we must consider the concept. Once again, we must consider the concept of mode of production. By no means is it the totality, not even abstract, of capital. By no means is it the totality of capital or of the capitalist system, as Althusser thinks. On the contrary, it is the manner, mode, determined disposition, in synchronic and diachronic, that is, immediately and historically, of the labor process, materially or technically speaking, as the formal production process of the valorization of value itself. You see, you have here several different layers of abstraction. This is the way in which you get to valorization, and the way, ultimately, that it depends on humans, on labor. Now, the question of what counts as an equivalence of labor, for example, robots, you kind of want to rethink that. Capital even and fundamentally changes the technical material process of labor, which manufactures products, commodities, and which is concretely subsumed in the valorization process. All the foregoing is the specifically capitalist mode of production. That is, the inventing, civilizing, technical power of capital as organic composition, I suppose. All right, next subsection 3.3, the second mode of subsumption, the social division of social labor. According to Marx, the division of labor, in the sense to be determined hereinafter, is the category of categories of political economy. Let us now see the reasons for this importance. Note this is a layer of abstraction, right? A category of categories. In the first place, against Smith, Marx determines a twofold sense of the division of labor. Quote, the one is division of social labor into different branches of labor. The other is the division of labor in the manufacture of a commodity, hence not division of labor in society, but social division of labor within one and the same workshop. So it is, kind of fixed, as it were, or focused on a certain time and place, right? Division of labor in the latter sense presupposes manufacture as a specific mode of production. That is the capitalist mode of production that, close quote, that is, Smith's whole kind of description of how wealth is built is focused on production in that sense. Now, according to Marx, there is then a difference between these two types of division of labor. On the one hand, there is a division of social labor, which produces different products or commodities. Some produce tables, others chairs, others tomatoes, as presuppositions of exchange and even of barter in the process of social production. On the other hand, this type of division, that is, the different commodities, is different from the social division of labor, which, assuming the foregoing division of labor, separates various operations. That is the division of labor that is the pin factory. Some produce the legs, others the wood surface, and others assemble the parts of the tables of the same object produced as commodity by capital. Quote Marx, the first division of labor shows itself in the fact that the production of a specific branch of labor confronts as a specific commodity the producers of all other branches of labor as independent commodities differing from it. The second division of labor, in contrast, takes place when a specific use value is produced before it comes onto the market, enters into circulation as a specific independent commodity. In the first case, the different kinds of labor complement each other through the exchange of commodities. In the second, there is direct cooperative action by the different kinds of labor, not mediated through the exchange of commodities with the aim of manufacturing the same use value under the command of capital. In the first division of labor, the producers meet as independent commodity owners and representatives of different branches of labor. In the second, they appear rather as dependent, since they only produce a complete commodity, indeed, only produce a commodity at all. Through their cooperation, and each of them represents not a specific piece of work, but rather the individual operations which are contained, which meet in a specific piece of work, while the commodity owner, that is, the producer of the complete commodity, before it goes to market, as you would say, confronts the independent workers as capitalists. Close quote. Now, that is to say, the division of labor to produce different products or commodities for exchange originates early in history. Producers can either be part of a community or of a modern bourgeois society. In capitalism, the laborer is always isolated, without a community, in everyday life, before and after work. But the second type of division of labor severs into particular jobs the parts of the product commodity, the parts of the product commodity. Each different task demands less skill, de-skilling, right? Less particularity, and in the end, it does not demand any. It is purely abstract labor. That's the issue that might be brought up, for example, in the early Saab factory, for example, car factory. Now, by contrast, labor ends in a part of the product within manufacture. Now, by contrast, labor ends in a part of a product within manufacture before reaching the marketplace. No laborer produces the whole product, its totality, but only an abstract portion analytically severed, right? The production line, made even more constrained by just-in-time supply. Anyway, in this second case, the division is social insofar as capital decides and controls each separation as a whole, not each laborer, and it is a division of social labor because particular laborers come from an isolated labor capacity before labor in everyday life and receive their sociability in an abstract and external unity, like perhaps in social media, under the control of capital, of the workshop, during the same production process. Likely the difference between, or the issue for the capitalist between working at home, working from home, and working at work. And, I think it's relatively clear in that sense. All right. Anyway, quote Marx, it is clear, number one, that this division of labor presupposes the social division of labor. First, the exchange of commodities develops the differentiation of social labor. And then the branches of labor become so widely separated that each specific branch is traced back to a specialized kind of labor. And the division of labor, its analysis can take place within this specialized labor. Now, it's equally clear, number two, that the second division of labor must, in its turn, extend the first, that is, reacting back upon it. This is specific to it insofar as it's able, in its analysis, to split up a speciality in such a way that the different components of the same use value are now produced as different commodities independent of each other. Close quote. All the foregoing technical advance of analytically dividing the parts of the objects assigned to specific works is formally directed by capital to make a more productive application of variable capital. The extent to which these means directly raise the productivity of the labor employed in a particular mode of production. Now, Marx points out, on the other hand, that when each worker produced the product isolated in his house and the capitalist purchased it and sold it, he was acting only as a merchant. Namely, the mode of production itself, in fact, was not capitalist. Adam Smith did not understand at all the transmutation of the mode of production itself by the social division as presupposition of social labor, that is, capitalist, properly speaking, in the same workshop. Presupposition of social labor in the same workshop. Thus, Marx, due to a detailed analysis of the technological process itself, understood the material determination which capital exerts on the labor process as such. It transforms it as technical labor because it needs to increase the productivity of labor in order to relatively diminish the value of wages. Now, that's that sense of, the wage bill as a cost, right? If you can minimize that cost, right, you get more, valorization, you get more stuff, you get more surplus, let's put it that way. In the workshop, laborers now have a social relation of production among them and with the capitalist within the organic interior of capital. Quote, for the worker himself, no combination of activities takes place. The combination is rather a combination of the one-sided functions under which every worker or number of workers is subsumed group by group. His function is one-sided, abstract, partial, piecework, right? The idea of piecework. The totality which is formed from this is based precisely on his merely partial existence and isolation in his separate function. The workers form the building blocks of this combination. However, the combination is not a relation that belongs to them, nor is it subsumed under them as a united group. The subsumption of the worker under capital is no longer merely formal. Close quote. The division of labor is thus the category of categories, right? Not unlike the negation of negation in that sense. Anyway, the structure in which labor in the productive act itself is determined as social and as capital. Quote, the increase of productive power which arises from the division of labor, this social mode of existence of labor, the social form of the workers' combined labors is the existence of capital over against the worker. He has himself become a mere detail. Close quote. Now, from here on, Marx briefly considers the Western tradition's thought, specifically among the Greeks, and more in detail in Plato, examples of the concept of the division of labor. Of course, in many of these cases, the division is performed not from the common essence, Gemeinwesen, which is not the case in capitalism. Thanks to Andrew Urey, that is 1778 to 1857, URE, especially the work used so much by Marx in the French translation Philosophe des Manufactures of 1836, or to Charles Babbage, 1792 to 1871, in his On the Economy of Machinery. And finally, thanks to Frederick Skarbek, 1792 to 1866, in his Theories of Social Wealth, Marx arrived at the triple division of labor. Marx, quote, the first, which we shall call general, Marx quotes Skarbek, which reminds us of paragraph 4 of chapter 12, volume 1 of Capital, brings about the division of the producers into agriculturalists, manufacturers, and traders. The second, which one could call particular, is the division of each branch of labor into species. The third division of labor, which one should designate as a division of tasks. That's the end of Skarbek's quote, close quote. Furthermore, Marx observes that the division of labor presupposes a great conglomeration of workers, which for a certain density of population is necessary, concentration of the instruments of labor. The division of labor leads to a differentiation and accordingly a simplification of the instruments which serve as means of labor. The other conditions of labor, particularly accommodation, factory buildings, can be regarded as a new addition to constant capital. All the foregoing implies a great increase of constant capital and a much more developed degree of the mode of production now formally capitalist. In other words, a mode of production corresponding to a particular historical stage of development of capital, close quote. In this sense, it can be understood why Marx deals here in a few pages with the question of productive labor, because labor is subsumed more than formally in the division of labor, and capital thus really incorporates it in productive processes. Labor is productive when subsumed by the division of labor. It posits surplus value, relatively decreasing the value of labor capacity because it's a commodity, right? Productive labor is the productive power of capital, where the process of alienation, estrangement of labor, the process of alienation, the Entauserung, the estrangement, the Anfundung of labor, shows not only how capital produces, as he had expressed it in the Grundrisse, but how capital is itself produced, its own genesis, as we can see in figure 3.1. Marx develops further the civilizing feature of division of labor as it overcomes the existing limit. Quote, capitalist production, hence the division of labor within the workshop according to certain rules, directly increases the free division of labor within society. Therefore, by constantly setting free a part of the labor force for new kinds of employment and thereby simultaneously developing needs which were so far latent or not present at all, and modes of labor to satisfy those needs. The idea that in your spare time you too can become an entrepreneur, etc. Anyway, subsection 3.4, the third mode of subsumption: machinery in the factory. This notebook 5 is in fact a transition towards notebook 19. Marx interpreted the writing of notebook 5 Marx interrupted the writing of Notebook 5 in March 1862 in an undetermined manuscript page, although perhaps on page 211, since there is a reference here to 26 November 1862, which indicates that it was written in January 1863, the moment in which he resumed writing this notebook. Months later, he continued with the subject of relative surplus value, in which he refers to machinery, a subject that was followed by the comparison between absolute and relative surplus value, which must have been item 4 of the plan, and concluded, all starting from notebook 19, the problem of accumulation, which received the number 4. That is to say, the subject matters of the future book 1 of Capital, that is volume 1 of Capital, the book, received in this notebook the treatment outlined in figure 3.2. So this is what volume 1 of Capital tries to explain, and particularly the difference in formal and real subsumption. Oh, it would seem that from the beginning, this notebook 5 would have been more theoretical, would have more theoretical density, as if certain discoveries of notebooks 6 through 14 would have been already considered. The category production costs is used, page 321. The discourse enters further into the moment of circulation. The moment of circulation, remember we talked about that before. That is sell, buy, social value, individual value, commodity price, fixed value, etc. Which leads us to think, the moment of circulation, it leads us to think that after considering the division of labor, Marx began to penetrate by critical confrontation, as we shall see, his theory of surplus value. Something extra is being taken out. It goes somewhere. How does it kind of manifest itself? And if it manifests itself as an abstraction, how, quote unquote, material might that abstraction be? All right, anyway, hence, on 28 January 1863, the month in which he had finished writing Notebook 5 and begun Notebook 19, stay with us here, he wrote to Engels, quote, I'm inserting certain things into the section on machinery. There are some curious questions which I originally failed to deal with in March 1862 or while writing the Grundrisse. To elucidate these, I have read through all my notebook excerpts on technology, the Grundrisse, the Technological Historical Notebook of 1851, and other notebooks, and am also attending a practical, purely experimental course for working men given by Professor Willis, close quote. And so we have figure 3.2, which tries to identify this little process. That is, notebooks 1 through 5 are the production process of capital, transformation of money into capital, absolute surplus value, relative surplus value, etc. Marx goes on to write notebooks 6 to 14 of the theories of surplus value. So we're looking at this kind of moment where Marx is beginning to think about surplus value. Afterwards, where it writes further, notebooks 15 through 18. And then goes back to notebooks 5, having, assimilated the kind of idea, which is, in this process, surplus value, continuation of the discussion of machinery, the relationship between absolute and relative surplus value, formal and real subsumption, and finally, fourth, accumulation. So there is an order to this, and even a process in that particular sense. The place of the subjects of volume 1 of Capital in the notebook. So we see the relation to volume 1 on the one side, and all of those subjects dealt with by the notebooks. These curious problems are specifically to the discussion regarding the difference between instrument, and machine. And then we're not approached until notebook 19, and hence are out of our current consideration. On the contrary, we will examine now the subject that is treated in the first part of notebook 5, which is a bit disconnected and written apparently at different times. There we find various discursive lines with a proposition of new categories overlapping each other, going through various levels, production, circulation, realization, in a disorderly fashion. Let us examine with epistemological attention, as an example, the first pages. Marx is interested in the following, quote, "Here, therefore, the surplus value appears to originate for him from selling, that is, from his taking advantage of the other owners of commodities from the fact that the commodity's price has risen above its value, not from the reduction in necessary labor time and the lengthening of surplus labor time. Yet, this too is merely the way things appear." And yes, that requires epistemological attention, one could assert. As one can see, Marx is situating himself at the level of realization, that is level 3. Hence, he speaks of price. But at the same time, of production, that is level 1, for example, of necessary time, he jumps. He jumps from one level to the other without mediation. At the same time, there seems to be a confusion when he deals in advance with the realization of capital, which does not correspond to the exposition of the future book 1. All this complicates his discourse. Sometimes we're at the level of constant capital, sometimes at the level of fixed capital, sometimes at the level of the realization of commodities. The order of his investigation at that moment is not the order of his subsequent exposition. In order to criticize the erroneous notion that surplus value is the fruit of circulation and not of production, this is a key point, the erroneous notion that the surplus value is the fruit of circulation and not of production, Marx begins a categorical discourse in which there are novelties. Almost too much for a notebook that is situated right after notebook 4. In fact, machinery reduces the value of the commodity. That is, it reduces its price, the price of the commodity. At the circulation level, and this is because it decreases the necessary labor time in its subjective sense and at the level of objective production. So things are not what they appear. We indicate the names of Marx's categories with quotation marks. Okay, because of machinery, quote unquote, qualified labor is abandoned. and replaced by simple, einfach labor of children or women. Namely, the socially necessary labor time is reduced. Footnote 7. That is the objective time necessary to produce the values of commodities. On the one hand, it diminishes the average time or average labor in order to reduce the socially necessary value of products. On the other hand, due to the reduction of average labor time, it results in an excess of price, an Überschuss des Preis of commodities, an excess of price of commodities, because its former value decreases. It surpasses its normal surplus value. When the mass of wages decreases to the average wage, the result is that production costs of labor capacity also decrease. To sum up and to put it in Marx's own words, the use of machinery has a principle that justifies its use. Its fundamental principle is the replacement of skilled labor by simple labor, this de-skilling, right? Hence also the reduction of the amount of wages to the average wage, right? Or the reduction of the workers' necessary labor to the average minimum, and the reduction of the production cost of labor capacity to the production cost of simple labor capacity, unquote. Different from the free mediations of the increase of productive power of cooperation or the division of labor, machinery is constant capital. It has a cost. It is a power or produced productive force. As constant capital, machinery adds to the product the value already included in it. Although it does not produce new value, machinery transfers to the product its own consumed value imperceptibly. Marx starts to pass to the concept of fixed capital, thus jumping from the concept of constant capital in production to fixed value in circulation. Well, it follows that the cheapening of the commodities produced by machines depends on the circumstance alone. The labor time contained in the machinery itself is less than the labor time contained in the labor capacity replaced by it. The value of machinery which enters into the commodity is less than, i.e., equals less labor time than the value of the labor replaced by it. Close quote. Machinery has a cost. Namely, it is a product of a labor process and productive process of surplus value. It is a capitalist commodity, but it does not produce surplus value, but only preserves its value, because in the productive process, its consumed value is not lost, but reappears. Quote, the use value of the machine and its replacement of human labor is its use value, does not determine its value. This is determined by the labor required to produce of machine itself, to the production of the machine itself. The total value of the machinery only reappears Wiederscheint in the totality of the commodity in whose production it has assisted as a means of labor. In other words, machinery is the product of human labor, and thus it contains value. In each item of the product, a portion of its value passes to the product during the labor process, and by means of a notional average calculation, one can determine which aliquot part of machinery enters into the value of product. This is all the business of, depreciation, etc., right? And amortization, I suppose. The magnitude of the value that is represented by the machinery that enters into the labor process makes the commodity relatively more expensive, but only insignificantly, to a much smaller extent than the manual labor replaced by the machinery would have done. In other words, You have the pin factory, you get a machine to replace each stage in the process. The same thing is being subsumed, right? But it is subsumed in a different measure, right? Than if you had multiple people operating multiple machines. If you got one machine like a robot to do all of those things. This means that no matter how big the capital advance for the purchase of machinery may seem with respect that one used to pay living labor, the value of the machinery that passes to the individual commodity shall always be proportionally lower than the value saved in wages. In other words, machinery devalorizes itself when transferring its value to commodity, but capital does not devalorize itself because, on the other hand, it devalorizes wages even more. Page 236. In fact, machinery has transformed labor into a less productive labor of its labor capacity or of the amount of product which corresponds to it because the quantity falling to his share is reduced. And this is the first consequence of introducing machinery. Why should I pay you more, for operating the machines, right? It seems like there's less activity and less effort exerted in the absolute, but in the relative, that's different. In fact, back to the text. In fact, Marx enumerates immediately 8 corollaries which result from the industrial and machinery revolution of capital. The first fruit is, paradoxically, that even though machinery proportionally reduces necessary labor time for the reproduction of labor capacity, nevertheless, the absolute time of the working day remains the same. You still punch in, punch out at the same time. There is then an over-exploitation, in addition to the relative surplus value obtained by introducing machinery, plus the foregoing absolute surplus value. In other words, instead of reducing labor time or increasing wages, capital absorbs the higher productivity of labor's productive power. And it does this in relative proportion. The machines don't tire out really. They wear, etc., but, they just do it less than people. But because the possible devalorization of machinery is accelerated, the tendency is to cover its expenses within the shortest period of time possible. Quote, Marx, the curtailment of necessary labor time is, of course, temporary and disappears once the general introduction of machinery into this branch has reduced the value of the commodity again to the labor time contained in it. Thus, a large part of the old machinery constantly loses part of its value or becomes entirely unusable before it has passed through its circulation period or its value has reappeared in the value of the commodities. This is the cause of the second effect or corollary of introducing machinery. An acceleration of overexploitation takes place, and not only is the necessary time reduced and the working day preserved, but in order to prevent the possible accelerated devalorization of machinery, the absolute time of the working day is technically increased. Quote, it is a general experience that as soon as machinery is employed in the capitalist way, once it takes on an independent existence as a form of capital vis-a-vis the worker, the absolute labor time, the overall working day, is not curtailed, but prolonged. Now, this idea of prolonging the working day, third shift, right? Perhaps. But back to the text. But the main cause of such an overexploitation is a fall in the rate of profit due to the increase of fixed and constant capital, which capital overcomes or compensates immediately by increasing the absolute time of labor. That is, greater increase of relative surplus value by machinery and absolute by the greater absolute time of the working day. So, in other words, if you're going to do this effectively or efficiently relative to the total amount invested in capital, you need to go to third shifts. The third consequence of introducing machinery in the valorization process is that due to the fact that the price of the product is reduced, since the value of labor capacity or necessary time for its reproduction. In order to pay the same wages, capital increases the rhythm of the labor process. Quote, this happens through the, so to speak, condensation of labor time, in which every part of the time it increases its labor content. The intensity of labor grows. There is growth, but in the quantity of labor performed within a given period, the pores of time are, so to speak, shrunk through the compression of labor, that is, of labor performed within a given period, close quote. Evidently, in this case, labor capacity is more rapidly worn out during the same hour of labor. Namely, overexploitation shortens the workers' lives. But at the same time, it allows capital to achieve a certain shortening of absolute labor time because the means to prolong the relative surplus time, page 339, are more and more powerful. It's faster, more accurate, lighter, lower cost machines. The fourth effect, we're rolling right along. The fourth effect of the subsumption of machine in capital is the replacement of simple cooperation by machinery. In other words, in the primitive workshop of manufacturing capitalism, it was necessary to organize work explicitly and before labor began. Machinery organizes laborers cooperatively in a direct form. You could, say the time clock you punch kind of does that, sort of. The fifth fruit is the invention and employment of machinery against strikes and against of wages. Marx points out at this point, quotes Ure, U-R-E, Ure, when capital enrolls science in her service, the refractory hand of labor will always be taught docility. In fifth place, however, machine creates the presumption of the workers in wishing to appropriate part of the productivity of their labor. In the seventh place, machinery allows for more continuity of labor, further allowing the use of low-cost raw materials. Lastly, and in eighth place, machinery produces the replacement of labor because of the reduction of necessary labor, reduction of time, or of necessary laborers, namely, eighth place is unemployment. Thus, a machine or an increase of surplus value transforms wage laborer into virtualiter pauper, virtually poor. There follows a passage in which the price of the commodity and wages are compared. Here, Marx writes that the laborer can never buy commodities for the value which they contain at the same prices as the wages received to produce it. Since he receives, for example, only 80% of the value produced, this is the possibility of crises. These 8 aspects, and the one previously mentioned, describe the concrete determinations of the real, not only formal, subsumption of labor in and by capital. Thanks to the introduction of machinery, are due to the transformation of manufactured capital into industrial capital, properly speaking. In any case, this Notebook 5 is abruptly interrupted to start another discourse, another theoretical work from Notebook 6 on. All righty, we got to the end. And yes, we went over time, but we got to the end. So we will start the next chapter subsequently, as they say. And let me stop the return to the show the meeting.